last week, Phil was asked us this question. I hope I noted this correctly. Who are you listening to? Is that right? Yeah. Glad I got that right. Who are you listening to? That was his question last week. And this morning I have a different question. I wasn't actually sure what the question was going to be, and then Mary summed it up perfectly, bringing that word earlier, which is, who did you come here to see? Who did you come here to see? We're continuing our series in Mark, so we're now up to Mark 8, and we're going to look at verse 22 to 26. Come up on the screen. I'll read it out, and then I'll say a few things on it. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. Why did he do that? When he had spat on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." And once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. And then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't even go into the village." Who did you come here to see? This particular passage in Mark, it's a kind of turning point in Mark. There's various ways that you can look at Mark and the structure of Mark, but this is one that's quite well supported. You've got kind of Act 1, which is Jesus' ministry in Galilee. Let's go around Galilee, teaching in the various and in the Decapolis as well. And then Act 2 starts with this passage, and it's the road or journey to Jerusalem, or the way to Jerusalem, you might put it. Okay, so it's quite a lengthy chunk of Mark where Jesus is traveling with his disciples and his entourage to Jerusalem. It's not the only time that Jesus went to Jerusalem, but it is the last time that Jesus goes to Jerusalem. And over the course of that journey, there are various accounts of various encounters with the disciples, and there's a kind of, how would I put it, a kind of an increasing and progressive kind of revelation of who Jesus is that comes about on that journey until they get to Passion Week, the week just before Jesus' death, when Jesus is crucified on the cross, and they think it's all over. Of course, gloriously, Jesus is resurrected, comes back to life, shows himself to them, and their entire worldview is turned upside down. And so, Mark 8:22 is the beginning of this second chunk of Mark, and I want to look at some questions that are coming directly from this passage. We'll ask a couple of questions of the passage we've looked at. I'm going to make some comments on healing more generally, because this is a passage about healing, isn't it? Right? A blind man who couldn't see can see again. That's pretty remarkable. Let us talk about that. And then I want to talk about what is the significance of this particular story, this particular account, being at this particular place in Mark's gospel. Right? I just said it's the turning point, it's the road to Jerusalem. Why is this account here? So we'll look at that as well. I don't know how long this man had been blind. It doesn't tell us in Mark. He may not have been blind since birth, because he could recognize people, trees, had some concept of what they looked like. But at the same time, as Phil pointed out last week, God is able to completely rewire someone's brain so that a deaf person who's been deaf since birth can talk and have language. So in the same way, it's entirely possible for God to rewire someone's brain so that someone who has no sight since birth can recognize people, recognize trees and so on, but may not have been blind since birth. It doesn't really matter. The point is he's been blind for some time, well known in the place, because it's the townspeople who bring out this blind man. Say, Jesus is coming. I've heard he can do miraculous healing. Let's go and get so-and-so, okay? Let's take him to Jesus. Maybe Jesus will heal him. So it's also well known, and they kind of go and take him to Jesus. Jesus takes him outside the village, okay, away from the crowds, and then Jesus spits on the man's eyes and then lays his hands on the eyes, okay? It takes more than one attempt, which is quite notable. He does it once, lays his hands on this man once, and the man is partially healed. And then he lays his hands on him again, and he's fully healed. That's unusual, because we don't have any other record of that ever happening. And the very fact that we have it recorded here means that it must have been seen as significant, because if you were writing a nice account of Jesus' life and you wanted to portray him as some miraculous healer, which he was, right? What you would do is, you tempted to do, is gloss over the details where it might, the one time it took 2 attempts, we'll just brush that one under the carpet. We won't write that one up, because there are plenty of other healings that we could write up. Let's just leave that one. But no, it's actually recorded for us, and so we must take note of that and see there must be some significance to the fact that it took 2 steps, if you like. Another question this raises is, why did Jesus tell him not to go into the village, and why did he take him out of the village in the first place? And I think that one's probably more easily dealt with, because if you've been listening over all of our our series on Mark so far, you will have seen lots of times where Jesus is basically doing crowd control and crowd management, where he is trying to avoid getting mobbed by the crowd, and the crowd trying to force him to be king. He's the Messiah. Quick, put a crown on him. Let's go and take him into Jerusalem. So there's lots of times where Jesus says, "Don't tell anyone. Right? Don't go back, or go to Jerusalem and show yourself to the priest rather than going back to your town and stirring up a big crowd." So I think that's probably what is going on here. Jesus is not fully revealing himself to everybody at this point as Messiah, and he is just managing that risk of everyone seizing him and trying to make him king, which we know is explicit elsewhere in the Gospels. But we'll come back to the why did it take more than one attempt. I think that's quite an important question that we need to answer. But I want to talk a bit about the healing. And if I'm entirely honest, I don't feel very qualified to talk about healing. I'm going to make some observations anyway. So we've been blind for some time, and we know that Jesus could and did heal people who've been blind since birth. So it was not an obstacle to him. It doesn't really matter, therefore, how long he'd been blind. Jesus was capable of restoring the sight, and I hadn't, Phil, until you said this last week, I hadn't got this insight that it would require a complete rewiring of his mind in order to be able to understand and interpret what his eyes were seeing, because our eyes, our brain's ability to see things forms as we are very young infants, right? And if we have problems with our sight when we're very young infants, we basically can't see properly. The brain can't get that ability back later in life. I've got a condition where my eyes are sort of see independently, if you like, okay? I don't have binocular vision. And the reason I don't have binocular vision is because when I was an infant, my eyes would point in different directions. Like I've got to squint. And because one will point this way and one will point that way, and they never point in the same direction, my brain never formed the ability to form binocular vision. So I can't have it now. It's impossible. Even if my eyes are corrected with glasses or anything else, even if I had sort of laser eye surgery, I'd never get the ability to have binocular vision. So for this man who's been healed, someone who's healed of blindness since birth, God's complete rewiring of their brain. So it's a much more, even bigger miracle than I ever previously appreciated. This man, they'd been brought to Jesus. He'd obviously been known as someone who was blind. So therefore, he hadn't been previously healed. I mean, that sounds an obvious thing, right? But there was a time when he wasn't healed and he was blind. And there was a time afterwards when he was healed. And then it came in stages. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't like, he's going to get better over a period of, years or whatever. It was a very clear step change, right? So it was miraculous, even though it required 2 steps. And then he was fully and completely healed in the end. And my point really is it was a discrete thing that happened. There was a time he was not healed. There was a time he was healed. We don't know anything about his background or his circumstances, but we know that the sin of an individual was no barrier to being healed. Obviously, if it was, then no one would be healed ever because we're all sinners. But just think of the case in particular of the paralytic who's lowered through the roof in Mark 2. And Jesus said to him, "Your sins are forgiven." And everyone went, "What? How can he say that? He's not allowed to say that." And he said, "Since you may know that the Son of Man came to forgive sins," Jesus also said, "Take up your mat and walk." So the healing was a proof or authentication of Jesus' ability to forgive sins. And a proof of it. But it also says to us that being a sinner is not a barrier to healing. And we find in the Acts of the Apostles, we find a similar pattern. These discrete incidences of healing. The apostles laid hands on some people and they were healed. Fully and completely. It wasn't an ambiguity about whether the person had been healed. Peter was so well known, right, for laying hands on people and then being healed, that people would try to just get into his shadow, it says in Acts, right? Just in the shadow of his, if I just get in Peter's shadow, maybe I'll be healed, right? He was that well known for it. But the apostles were in a certain place at a certain time, and they would lay hands on people, and those people would be healed, and people elsewhere were not being healed at that time. So there's never a kind of automatic power. When Jesus was born, not everyone in the world was healed. And during Jesus' ministry, not everyone in the world was healed. And when Jesus died on the cross, not everyone in the world was healed. And when he was resurrected, not everyone in the world was healed. And when he ascended to heaven, not everyone in the world was healed. So it was clearly a discrete act that happened. This person is healed. That person is healed. That person, that person. And we know from Acts as well and the letters that some believers died without being healed. So it wasn't the case that eventually at some point everyone would be healed in their life on this earth. I think of Jesus saying, "You will always have the poor with you." And the response to that was not, so don't bother about them. Don't bother about the poor. There'll always be poor people, so don't bother. Right? Jesus' church, one of our primary missions is to serve those in need, right? One of the mission of the church, always have the poor with us, so we'll always have a mission to the poor. I think in a similar way, we'll always have the sick with us. So it isn't a case of, then we'll just have to give up on that. But actually, we'll always have the sick with us, so we always have a mission to serve those who are sick. in the New Testament letters, there's an expectation that if you need healing, that you will call the elders to lay hands on you and pray for you. James 5, is anyone among you sick? Let them call the elders of the church to pray over them and anoint them with oil in the name of the Lord. I don't think it necessarily has to be the elders. Just before the elders panic, it's particularly in a very large church, you're going to struggle to scale that much. But the point is this, that the New Testament, James, he clearly thinks it's part of an elder's job description. So part of an elder's job description, what to pray, minister the word, lay hands on the sick. And it's all part of an elder's job description. What do elders do in the church? Well, those are three of the things that they do, part of their job description. But I think more importantly, it means this, that gifts of healing were not restricted to the apostles, because not all of the elders of the churches were apostles. There was clearly an expectation that when the elders lay hands on people, sometimes they would be healed. Otherwise, it's a bit pointless, right? Sometimes they would lay hands on people, those people would be healed, and clearly, therefore, there was gifts of healing that were beyond the apostles, weren't restricted to the apostles, that were given to the elders of the church, and I would argue more widely than the elders of the church, because what does Paul say in 1 Corinthians 12? He talks about eagerly desiring spiritual gifts, and what does he name and list as one of the spiritual gifts is gifts of healing? So he's saying the whole church eagerly desire gifts of healing. And so I think we see Jesus healing people, and it is pretty amazing and pretty miraculous. And we see the apostles, we see Peter, people so well known that people are trying to just get into his shadow. We see Paul laying his hands on people, but also in the New Testament, there were the less well known, the unsung heroes who are laying hands on people and seeing people healed, the elders of the church and others. And that means also that the gifts of healing are for today as well as when the apostles were alive on earth. Now, we're in a charismatic church, hopefully not too much of a shock, but I just want to stress that because I don't think there's any warrant from the Bible, when I read the New Testament and my reading, that to say that miraculous healings stopped when the last apostle died. John dies, and that's it. They all just all stopped. I think there is a clear warrant in the New Testament to say this is for the church, for the entirety of the church age. And I think what's more, even if they had stopped, Paul says, eagerly desire them to come back, right? So there's no warrant to say, well, okay, let's not bother about those anymore. Right, gifts of healing are for the church today. And as I was preparing this, I'm reading this in the New Testament that says, it's encouraging us to look for gifts of healing and to lay our hands on the sick when they're, and the injured. At the same time, in my heart, I'm thinking, do I eagerly desire gifts of healing? And I was challenged on this. Because I don't know, some of you will probably identify this. I'm a bit of a skeptic, probably not a surprise. I'm a bit of a skeptic. And when I hear an account, a third-hand, fourth-hand, fifth-hand account of someone being healed, part of me goes, yeah, really? I'm just, maybe it's a lack of faith, but I think really, actually, in today's world, there's just lots of stuff that isn't true that we hear, right? And it's really hard to sift through what's true and what's not true, and especially when you get, all kind of accounts from all kinds of places. Something that really builds my faith up is when I hear first-hand accounts from people in this church who come up and they get the mic and they a first-hand account of what happened to them or what happened when they lay hands on someone else. And I think one of the antidotes to skepticism is that people you trust, you guys, me, you guys, if you come up, I give you a lot more weight than some random person on the internet, right, that's been copy-pasted however many times. But those accounts, those testimonies, they really build my faith anyway. I don't know about anyone else, right? I really value people coming and giving testimonies of what God did through them, through you, right? Because it's really encouraging, but also saying, oh, that could be me. Yeah, God could heal someone. I could lay hands on someone, and they could be healed. And so I'd really encourage you to first of all, to come and give testimonies of everything that God does through you. It really does build up the church. And I'd also say, do you eagerly desire spiritual gifts in general, but particularly the gifts of healing? Do you eagerly desire it? That eager is quite a strong word, isn't it? To eagerly desire gifts of healing. And if I'm honest, a lot of the time it'd be nice, wouldn't it? It'd just be, but I don't really have the faith now. I don't really believe it's going to happen. And honestly, I was convicted by preparing this that I don't think I do eagerly desire gifts of healing, if I'm honest. And so I thought it'd be good to just stop at this point and pray, actually, because we're probably at various points of the spectrum. There's some of us who are like, I don't believe healing is a thing at all. That's just not real. Right? That's the one end of the spectrum. And there's some of you who've been like, of course, every time I pray for someone, they're healed. What are you talking about, Chris? Right? Probably a spectrum. Like you're probably somewhere on the spectrum, right? You might be like, well, I wish I did eagerly desire gifts of healing. You'd be like, I do eagerly desire them. I don't see them that often. You know what I mean? So I'm just going to take a moment, and I want us to close our eyes and think about where are you on that spectrum, okay? I want you to pray to the Father that he will help you move to a point where you're eagerly desiring spiritual gifts, and that when you lay hands on people, you are seeing people healed. Okay, so just take a moment, and then I'll pray for all of us, but we'll just pray in our heads individually first. Father, Paul encouraged the Corinthians, and I take it as an encouragement to us to eagerly desire spiritual gifts of all kinds. And I pray, Father, that you would lay on our hearts, eagerly desire gifts of healing. Not as a spectacle, but to build up your church and as a proof of the gospel. Father, I pray that you would stir our hearts and move us to that place where we're eagerly desiring, that when we pray and lay hands on people, there's an eager desire to see healing, to see your church built up, and to see your name glorified. Amen. So that's talking about physical healing. It's wonderful this man was healed. I think we don't know him. He was alive a long time ago. Actually, I look forward. I hope that he put his faith in. I hope that one day I'll be able to meet him and just hear his full story, his full backstory. I can't give you his full backstory, but one day I hope that I can give you, and then find out his full backstory. I want to move on and talk about the opening of spiritually blind eyes as well, because I think that's really definitely in view here too. Why do I think there's something going on about this spiritual blindness as well? Mark 8:18, just before this, Jesus says to his disciples, "Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear?" Right? So that's just happened just before the incident here. And then immediately after this, we get the healing of this blind man in 2 stages. And it really calls back to, you remember in Luke, Jesus goes into the temple and he gets a scroll of Isaiah, opens the scroll, and he finds Isaiah 61, and he reads from Isaiah 61. And Isaiah 61, it's one of the servant songs. There's some, in Isaiah, there are some songs, there's lots of oracles, lots of prophecies, oracles in Isaiah. And some of them are called the servant songs. And Isaiah 61 is one of these. Okay, and there's another one, Isaiah 42 as well. Put them up on the screen. And Jesus is reading from these. Isaiah 61 is really like, Isaiah 42 introduces this servant who's going to have a special mission for God. And then Isaiah 61 is a bit like the servant's manifesto. So when Jesus reads this out in the synagogue, right, it's Jesus reading this out as his manifesto. It says, today this has been fulfilled in your hearing. In fact, he stops a little bit early in the song, because what he effectively is saying, my first coming, this bit's been fulfilled. My second coming, this bit be fulfilled. So but it's a saying. This is me, says Jesus. He reads it out and takes it to himself. Isaiah was written. These servant songs were written about 700 years before Jesus' birth, right? And in them there is a servant king, a Messiah, but he was going to be somehow a suffering servant. So the big question was, well, how and why would he suffer? You know, what is going on there? This was a bit of a puzzle, and it's quite easy for us to look back with Christian eyes, because it's so ingrained with us. I've noted down some of the lyrics earlier. Songs, servant and king, rescued the world, this is our God, right? Or suffering in my place. And it's so easy for us to, it's so ingrained if you sing these songs regularly to think, oh yeah, of course, that's Jesus, obviously. But at the time, when Jesus came, this was not so obvious. This was not so obvious. Because it wasn't obvious how this servant was going to achieve redemption and salvation, and yet at the same time suffer. It wasn't clear his relationship to God. If you read the servant songs, there's a kind of, is it God speaking? Is it Isaiah the prophet speaking? Or how can God, none of this kind of made much sense, and people were trying to get their heads around it. There was in the Dead Sea Scrolls from the Qumran community, they studied Isaiah extensively to try to understand what it was that was being said here. They had their ideas, others had their ideas. But there's a few things I think I've highlighted, okay? He's sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind. So that's what Jesus said, Luke 4. Isaiah 61 is similar. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captive and release from darkness the prisoners. Or the version that Jesus was reading from would have, it wasn't the version he was reading from, but the version that was derived from what he was reading from would have the blind. And then Isaiah 42 is the main one, which says to open the eyes that are blind and to free captives from prison and to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. Okay? And then they will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting for the Lord, for the display of his splendor. Okay? And so you have here these passages which would be really well known, but people didn't exactly know what they meant. And there'd be questions like, well, does it mean like literal opening of the blind's eyes? Or is it like figurative? Is it spiritually blindness that's been, is it literal release of people from dungeons, like our political prisoners are all going to be freed? Or is it people being freed from sort of a figurative darkness or dungeon? And they would have these debates and be trying to figure this out. One of the interesting things is all four of those options are found in the New Testament. All four, Jesus healed literal eyes of the blind and also opened spiritual eyes. There is literal release of the apostles from prison, from dungeons and Paul. And there's also the figurative release from bondage to sin. All four of those are found in the gospel. And Mark understands this question. He understands about it. Could it be literal? Could it be figurative? Well, which ones does a person have to fulfill in order to be the Messiah? Which boxes do they have to tick? All that kind of thing. And so he deliberately puts, this opening of the eyes of a physically blind man immediately before the spiritual opening of the disciples' eyes to Jesus being the Messiah. He puts them together to make the point that Jesus is fulfilling this servant song from Isaiah 42. Because we might expect, I don't know about you, but when I first read the Bible and when I first read the Gospels, I read them a bit like you would read a biography, expecting it to start with, Jesus was a baby, and then this happened, and this happened, and then finish at the end. And what happened as I grew to understand the Bible better, is I realized they're not written like that. That's our modern expectation. That's a kind of a modern kind of, how we'd write biographies today. But they're arranged in a different order. But it's not random. It's not haphazard. It's not just like Mark just threw, the parchment on, lying around and just gathered them all up and just wrote them down in some random order. He's structured, all of the Gospels are structured really intentionally and purposefully. And Mark has been familiar with this, with Isaiah and the servant songs. It's very plausible he heard one or two sermons about them from the apostles. You might have heard a sermon from Peter, for example, talking about this incident of Jesus opening the physical eyes of this man and then linking it to the opening of spiritual eyes and Peter's eyes being opened. It's not that's entirely plausible. So when Mark is writing his gospel and he's got this background of the early church's understanding in mind, he would have structured his gospel with that in mind in order to bring those points out. Mark doesn't provide a running commentary in his gospel, so we don't know. It's not explaining why he's put that there or that there. But it almost certainly has these things in his head. So, let's come back to that question of why did it take more than one attempt? Hopefully we can explain it. I think the reason is because the healing of this man, a real physical healing, acts as it's a parable. It's a real-life, acted-out parable of the opening of spiritual eyes. In 1 Corinthians 13, between 12 and 14 we looked at, Paul writes, "For we know in part and we prophesy in parts, but when completeness comes, what is in part disappears." So Paul is writing about this concept of we only see some, but we'll see all later. And I think the disciples' eyes were going to be opened, but they were not fully open to start with. I don't want to, well, it's a bit of a spoiler alert, but let's go on to why did they have to be open? Jesus said this elsewhere in Luke, he said, "Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into a pit?" That the reason the apostles' eyes had to be opened is because they couldn't possibly lead anyone else to Christ if their eyes were not open themselves. It's the same for all of us. If our eyes are not open, spiritually open, or just lead someone else into a pit. Right? When we're making disciples, we have to make sure that we know where we're going and that we have the light of Jesus, because otherwise we're going to lead people into trouble. So Jesus says, "Do you have eyes but fail to see?" And then we've got the healing of the blind man. And then, spoiler alert, in a few verses, Peter is going to confess, this is next week, is going to confess to Jesus, "You are the Christ." But unfortunately, his sight is not perfect because he doesn't get the suffering servant bit. He understands that Jesus is the Messiah. He doesn't understand that the Messiah has to suffer. So he says to Peter, "No, forbid it that you will go to the cross." And Jesus turns to him and says, "Get behind me, Satan." It's just can't see it yet. But then 6 days later, Peter, James, John, they go up the mountain. They see Jesus in his glory, transfigured. And then John 16, Jesus promised his disciples the Spirit of truth. The Spirit of truth that will give you, he will not speak on his own, he will speak only what he hears, and he will tell you what is yet to come. So the Spirit of truth is going to guide them in all truth. So there's going to be this revelation that comes, yes, Jesus is Messiah, but I don't understand why he has to suffer. And then, yes, he does have to suffer. And yes, now I see why that, and so that revelation. I think also there is the possibility of an even greater revelation when Jesus comes again. You know, Isaiah 61, that's certainly what's in view. There's a first and second coming of Jesus in view there. So as we go through the next few weeks, and as we look for that journey, that way to Jerusalem, look out for that increasing revelations that disciples, they start to get it over time. There's lots of missteps and false starts along the way, all of which help us to understand who Jesus is and who Jesus is not. I'm going to just finish by reading from John 12. Now, there were some Greeks among those who went up to worship at the festival. And they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, with a request. Sir, they said, we would like to see Jesus. And Philip went to tell Andrew, and Andrew and Philip in turn told Jesus. And Jesus replied, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly, I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. If it dies, it produces many seeds. Anyone who loves their life will lose it, while anyone who hates their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, my servant also will be. My Father will honor the one who serves me. Now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. No, it was for this very reason I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name. And then a voice came from heaven. I have glorified it and will glorify it again. And the crowd that was there and heard it said it had thundered, and others said an angel had spoken to him. And Jesus said, this voice was for your benefit, not mine. Now is the time for judgment on this world, and now the prince of this world will be driven out. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. And he said this to show the kind of death that he was going to die. The crowd spoke up. We have heard from the law that the Messiah will remain forever. So how can you say the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man? And then Jesus told them, you are going to have the light just a little while longer. And walk while you have the light before darkness overtakes you. Whoever walks in the dark does not know where they're going. Believe in the light while you have the light, so that you become children of light. And when he had finished speaking, Jesus left and hid himself from them. Two Greeks, they come, they ask to see Jesus, they want an audience with him. They want to see him with their eyes and speak to him with their mouths. But they receive something far better. They see, just for a moment, the veil of heaven is pulled back. They hear a voice from heaven, and they're given spiritual sight. They're given the ability to see Jesus in his glory. I won't read it, but Peter, on the day of Pentecost, gives this great sermon. And one of the things I love about this sermon in Acts is that it's the culmination of Peter's arc, really. And when Peter shows that he's really got it, finally, he has seen who Jesus really is. He has seen Jesus in his glory, lifted up, ascended to heaven. And out of that, he is able to bring light to others. He is able to lead others because he has finally seen the light and understands. And so, I'm going to repeat Mary's question to us. What did you come here to see? And I'm going to finish with another opportunity to pray. It's a very simple prayer. I would like to see Jesus. I want us to pray that prayer. I would like to see Jesus. There's no point in coming here unless your prayer is, I would like to see Jesus. And so let us close our eyes and pray this and just wait on the Lord for a brief moment, and then we'll close.